They all laughed when the old man handed over his last winter money for a dying foal. To them, the little Morgan was already finished. Ribs showing, legs shaking, mud dried across its face, tied beside a butcher's cart like something no one would miss. But Walter Bennett saw something different. He saw a pair of dark eyes that had not given up yet. So he brought the foal home through the cold roads of New Hampshire, wrapped it in his late wife's blue wool blanket, and let his grieving grandson name it Scout. Winter came hard after that, quiet at first, then cruel. And one night, when the boy's breathing began to fail and the mountain road vanished beneath a blizzard, Walter had only one chance left. The same foal everyone had laughed at would have to carry him into the storm. Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and be part of the journey. Now let's get into it. Late autumn lay low over the White Mountains, damp with wet maple leaves and wood smoke under a pale grey sky. By noon, the livestock yard in Conway had turned to mud. Wagon tires and pickup trucks had cut brown grooves through the ground, and the smell of hay, manure, cold iron, fried dough, and damp wool hung over everything like an old quilt that had been left too long in the barn. Beyond the auction sheds, the hills rose dark with spruce and bare maple, their shoulders already carrying the first thin warning of winter. Men stood with paper cups of coffee warming their hands. Women in heavy coats moved between pens, checking chickens, calves, sacks of feed, whatever could be bought cheap before snow closed the smaller roads. Walter Bennett had come for chicken feed and nothing else. He was 74 years old, a widower from a narrow road north of town where the mailboxes leaned into the wind and the houses sat far enough apart that neighbours waved more often than they visited. For most of his life he had worked for the county road department, driving ploughs in winter, clearing ditches in spring, patching frost-broken asphalt in summer. Time had bent him some, not kindly, but thoroughly. His shoulders were broad once, though now they sloped forward beneath a faded brown canvas coat. His hands were thick, knuckled and scarred, with nails that never looked clean, no matter how hard he scrubbed them. His face was square and weathered, the skin pale in winter and freckled where years of road glare had marked it. A short white beard roughened his jaw. His hair, thin and silver, showed beneath a brown knit cap his wife had made for him before her fingers grew too stiff. He still wore that cap, even when it itched. At home, Samuel would be waiting. 12 years old, quiet at the table, quieter when the wind rose. The boy had been living with Walter since the accident that took his parents on a rain-slick road outside Littleton. Walter had never known what to say to a child who had lost everything in one afternoon. So he made oatmeal. He fixed the porch step. He kept the woodbox full. Some men prayed with words. Walter had always prayed by doing the next necessary thing. He had paid for 2 sacks of feed, counted the coins left in his palm, and slipped them back into his pocket with the private shame of an old man who knew exactly how many dollars stood between him and spring. There had been a time when he would have bought a spare sack, just in case. These days, just in case had become a luxury. He lifted one sack onto his shoulder, felt his knee complain, set it down again, and decided he would make 2 trips to the truck. Pride at his age had to negotiate with bone. He was almost at the gate when he heard the laughter. It did not rise all at once. It came in pieces first, a snort, a cough, a low chuckle shared between men who thought cruelty was funnier when several people agreed on it. Then a sharper voice cracked across the yard. "Glue plant's about the only place for that thing." Walter stopped. At the far corner of the lot, near a butcher's wagon with red mud splashed along its wheels, a man in a greasy wool jacket was pulling on a rope. Not leading, pulling. At the other end of it stumbled a foal, so thin Walter did not understand at first how it was still upright. It was an American Morgan, or should have been. The shape was there beneath the ruin of it, a compact little body, a fine head, legs meant someday to carry strength. But the foal could not have been more than 6 or 7 months old. Its dark brown coat was matted with mud and burrs, dull where it should have held a winter sheen. Ribs showed in hard bars under the skin, its belly tucked up too sharply, its tail hung low and dirty, barely moving. Each step came wrong, not quite a limp, not quite a collapse, but a trembling compromise between the two. When the rope jerked, the foal's head dipped, and its front knees nearly folded. Several men laughed. One slapped the side of the butcher's cart as if he had heard a good joke in church and could not hold it in. A pair of boys watched from behind a gate, their faces uncertain, trying to decide which side of the world they were expected to join. Walter felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest. Not anger first. Anger came later, useful and hot. This was older than anger. It was the feeling of seeing something helpless in the open and knowing that if he looked away, the looking away would follow him home. He told himself it was not his business. He had feed to load, a boy to get back to, a stove that smoked when the wind came east, a pension check that arrived too slowly and disappeared too quickly. He had already learned more than once that love did not keep everything safe. Sometimes love emptied your hands and left you standing in a quiet kitchen with a chair no one used anymore. The man with the rope cursed and yanked again. The foal slipped in the mud. Its breath came out in thin white bursts. One ear flicked backward, the other stayed low, not relaxed, just worn out. A crust of dried mud covered its forehead, and beneath that something pale showed for a moment, before disappearing again as the head dipped. Walter moved before he had finished deciding to. He crossed the yard slowly, because old knees hated mud, and because there was no dignity in falling in front of men already eager to laugh. A woman near the calf pen glanced at him and then away. The butcher's cart smelled of old blood, leather straps, cold metal, and wet straw. The foal did not pull back when Walter came near. That was the worst of it. A frightened animal resisted. This one only stood there, sides quivering, as though resistance belonged to a stronger creature. Walter stopped 2 steps away. The foal raised its head. Its eyes were black, deep, and dulled by exhaustion, but not empty. Walter had seen empty. He had seen it in wounded deer at the roadside, in men after funerals. In Samuel the first week he came to the house and sat at the kitchen table without touching the biscuits. This was not empty. Somewhere inside that small battered body, one coal remained under the ash. The man holding the rope squinted at Walter. He was thick-necked, red-faced from cold or liquor, with a cap pulled low and a mouth made mean by habit. "You buying, old-timer, or just admiring?" A few men chuckled. Walter looked at the foal again. Mud clung to its lashes. Its lower lip trembled once, then stilled. One hoof shifted, searching for ground that did not hurt. "How much?" Walter asked. The seller laughed through his nose. "For him? Whatever's in your pocket. By morning he won't be worth the rope." The laughter came again, but thinner this time, because Walter was not smiling. He reached into his coat and brought out the folded bills he had been saving in the inner pocket, not the coins for coffee, not the grocery money, but the money meant to stretch the household through the lean edge before winter truly set in. He looked at it in his hand. The paper felt soft from being counted too many times. He thought of Samuel at the kitchen table, pushing peas around his plate. He thought of his wife's empty chair, the one he still could not bring himself to move because grief had strange housekeeping habits. He thought of the small, white church outside town, where the hymnals smelled of dust and lemon oil, and of something his wife once said when he complained about helping a neighbor fix a fence for free. "Walter, if the Lord puts need in front of you, he probably noticed you had hands." He hated how often she was still right. Walter handed the money over. The seller blinked, then grinned like a man who had found a fool and did not mind keeping him. "Suit yourself." When Walter took the rope, the foal flinched at the change of hands. Not much, just enough. Walter lowered his voice, though he had no grand words to offer, and no promise he was sure he could keep. "All right," he said. "Easy now." He did not pull. He waited. After a long moment, the foal took one shaking step toward him, then another. Mud sucked at its hooves. The crowd lost interest slowly, disappointed that the joke had grown quiet. Someone muttered that old men and useless animals belonged together. Someone else laughed once, but it sounded smaller with the mountains listening. Walter led the foal past the gate, past the feed sacks he had bought, past the smell of coffee and manure and cold rain. The animal leaned lightly against the rope, not trusting, not surrendering, only following, because standing still had become impossible. At the edge of the yard it stumbled, and Walter put one rough hand against its neck to steady it. The skin beneath the muddy coat was warm and thin. The foal's breath touched his sleeve in short, cloudy bursts. Then, as it lifted its head, a flake of dried mud broke loose from its forehead. Underneath, Walter saw a small white mark, not clear, not clean, just a pale sliver shaped almost like the first point of a star, as if someone had pressed light there and forgotten to finish. He looked at it only a second. Then he tightened his hand gently around the rope, turned toward the grey road out of Conway, and led the little horse away. The road home from Conway climbed into colder air, where the last yellow leaves clung to the maples like small tired flags. Walter Bennett did not hurry. He could not have hurried if he had wanted to. The foal moved beside him in short, uneven steps, its head low, its rope loose in Walter's hand. Every few yards the little Morgan stopped as if the earth had asked too much of its legs. Walter stopped too. He did not tug. He stood, with one hand on the rope and the other pressed against the ache in his lower back, watching his own breath drift white in front of him. By the time he reached the narrow road that led to his place, evening had gone blue between the trees. His truck followed behind in fits and starts, feed sacks in the bed, the foal tied loosely to the side, while Walter walked beside it rather than ride inside. It would have been faster to drive straight home. It also would have been cruel. So the old man walked, one boot after another, mud drying on his cuffs, his knee giving its familiar complaint with every rise in the road. The house stood where it always had, small and plain under the darkening pines, with smoke lifting from the chimney in a thin grey thread. A single porch light burned above the steps. In the kitchen window Walter saw Samuel's shape before the boy saw him. Thin shoulders, brown hair sticking up in the back. Stillness too old for 12. Samuel opened the door before Walter could call out. He stood in the warm rectangle of kitchen light, wearing an old flannel shirt that hung too wide at the wrists. For a moment he looked not at Walter, but past him, toward the shadow moving weakly beside the truck. "What is that?" Samuel asked. Walter looked down at the foal. The little animal's sides trembled, its ears angled back, not flat with anger, only tired and unsure. Mud had dried in patches along its neck. Burrs clung under its mane. Its tail hung like a dirty rope. "A bad bargain?" Walter said softly. Samuel did not smile. He stepped off the porch and came only as far as the bottom stair. The foal lifted its head a little at the sound of him, then lowered it again. Walter led the animal around to the old barn behind the house. It had not held a horse in years. Chickens scratched under the lean-to, and swallows had left mud nests high in the rafters, but the last stall still stood in the corner, away from the mountain wind. Walter slid the door open. The barn breathed out the smells of dry hay, lamp oil, old apples gone soft in a crate, dust, leather, and a kind of stored warmth that belonged to other winters. He spread fresh straw slowly, using the pitchfork like a man careful not to wake something sleeping. Then he brought the foal inside. The animal hesitated at the stall door. Its nostrils widened. It could smell people, rope, chickens, rusted tools, old wood. It could smell safety too, perhaps, though Walter did not trust that word yet. Safety had to prove itself more than once. "All right," Walter murmured. "Nobody's pulling you now." The foal took one step, then another. When its front legs buckled, Walter caught it at the neck and shoulder, feeling how little flesh lay between bone and skin. Together, awkwardly, they lowered it into the straw. It folded down rather than lay down, as if the whole body had been held together by stubbornness and had finally run out of string. Samuel stood in the barn doorway, both hands hidden in his sleeves. "Is it going to live, Grandpa?" Walter kept his eyes on the foal. He had shoveled snow off roads for 40 years, had seen cars in ditches and deer broken under headlights, had learned that some answers should not be given too quickly. "I don't know," he said. Inside the house, he warmed milk in a small pan and stirred in a little honey. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and the onion soup Samuel had left untouched on the stove. Walter opened the narrow cupboard where he kept jars of dried herbs from summers when his wife still filled the kitchen with bunches of mint, yarrow, and red clover tied with string. His hand stopped on a folded piece of blue wool on the lower shelf. The blanket. It had belonged to Ruth. She had used it across her knees near the end, when even August evenings made her cold. 3 years had passed, and Walter had dusted around that shelf more times than he had touched what lay on it. Now he took the blanket out. For a second he held it against his chest, as if testing whether grief still had weight. It did. He carried the milk, the herbs, and the blue blanket back to the barn. Samuel followed without being asked. The foal flinched when Walter came near with the bowl. He stopped, lowered himself onto one knee, and waited until the animal's breathing slowed a little. Then he set the bowl near its nose. The foal did not drink at first. Its lips moved weakly. One ear twitched toward Samuel when the boy shifted his feet. "Don't crowd him," Walter said. Samuel nodded and backed up an inch. At last, the foal touched the milk. Then again. Not much. Enough. Walter laid the blue blanket across the trembling body. The color looked strange against all that mud and bone, like a piece of sky dropped into a ditch. Samuel watched, and something in his face changed. Not hope exactly. Hope was too large a word for that barn, but attention, a small flame cupped against wind. For 3 days the house changed its rhythm around the animal. Walter rose before dawn to check the stall. He warmed milk, mixed herbs, rubbed the foal's thin legs with slow circles, and cleaned mud from its coat with damp cloths. The foal did not fight him. That worried him more than resistance would have. Sometimes its body shivered so hard the straw trembled underneath. Sometimes it slept with its head stretched flat, breath shallow enough that Walter bent close to make sure it was still there. Samuel came before school and after. He did not talk much. He sat on an overturned bucket outside the stall, and watched the foal's ears, the rise of its ribs, the slow blink of its eyes. Once, very quietly, he pushed an apple slice across the straw. The foal only smelled it and turned away. Samuel picked it up later and put it in his own pocket, as if the rejection might embarrass the animal. On the third afternoon, Dr. Harold Pike drove in from Bethlehem in an old green pickup that sounded tired before it came around the bend. He was a narrow man in his late 60s, with a white moustache, red cheeks, and grey eyes that missed very little. His canvas field coat was patched at one elbow, his boots carried dried mud from half the farms in northern New Hampshire, and his voice had the dry scrape of pine bark. He took off his gloves in the barn and said, "Let's have a look." Walter stood back. Samuel stayed near the door. Dr. Pike worked without hurry. He ran his hands along the foal's legs, lifted each hoof, listened to its chest, pressed gently along the ribs. The longer he examined, the quieter the barn became. Outside, a loose shutter tapped once in the wind. A chicken scratched under the wall. The foal's breath came thin and quick. Then the veterinarian moved the blanket aside and found what the mud had hidden, old bruises yellowing under the coat. Newer ones dark and tender. A rib that had healed crooked beneath the skin. On the left shoulder, a red, raw-looking mark shaped by heat, not accident. Dr. Pike's mouth tightened. He did not swear. That made it worse. "This wasn't neglect," he said at last. "Somebody hurt this animal on purpose." Walter's hand found the stall rail. His fingers closed around the rough wood until a splinter bit his palm. Dr. Pike looked at him, not unkindly. "I can't promise you he'll make it." "He?" Samuel asked from the doorway. The vet glanced back at the foal. "Young colt, 6 months, maybe 7. Samuel absorbed that as if it mattered greatly. Maybe it did. Dr. Pike left medicine instructions and a silence heavier than both. When his truck disappeared down the road, the evening light had gone amber at the barn door. Walter stayed beside the stall, one hand still on the rail. He looked at the red mark on the colt's left shoulder, then at the forehead, where Samuel had wiped away more dried mud with a careful cloth. The white mark showed clearer now. A star. Small, uneven at the edges, but unmistakable. Walter had once owned a mare named Bess. He had sold her 22 years ago in the hardest winter of his life, when Ruth's hospital bills sat on the kitchen table like stones and the bank called every Thursday morning. Bess had been dark-coated too, with a white star on her forehead and a reddish mark on her left shoulder. Walter had told himself there had been no choice. He had said it often enough that the words should have become true. They never had. That night, after Samuel had gone quiet beside the stall, Walter lowered himself to his knees in the straw. His joints cracked, his back burned. He did not ask God for a miracle large enough to frighten a man. He only bowed his head near the manger and asked for one more morning. Samuel's voice came softly from the bucket by the door. "Could we call him Scout?" The colt's ear moved. Walter opened his eyes. The little horse lay under Ruth's blue blanket, thin as a shadow, breathing shallow, but breathing. The white star on his forehead held the lamplight. Walter did not answer right away. He just stood there a long time, looking at that small, pale mark in the dark. Winter did not arrive all at once in Walter Bennett's valley. It waited at the edges, then closed its hand. For a while the mornings only silvered the grass. The water trough wore a skin of ice thin enough to break with one finger. Frost gathered on the fence rails and turned every nailhead white. Then one night the wind came down from the high ridges and shook the house until the old windows gave small, tired rattles in their frames. By morning, snow had covered the pumpkins left beside the porch, softened the roof of the barn, and filled the ruts in the yard. as if the world had been forgiven for a moment. Inside the barn, Scout was still alive. That alone changed the shape of Walter's days. He no longer woke to the empty quiet of the kitchen and the slow complaint of his own bones. He woke, listening. First for the wood stove ticking in the next room. Then for Samuel's careful steps upstairs. Then, through the walls and the cold blue before dawn, for any sound from the barn. A hoof shifting in straw, a weak breath, the small scrape of a bucket against wood. The colt did not recover in a way that looked fine from a distance. There was no sudden strength, no bright morning where everything old fell away. Healing came like a shy animal itself. One day Scout did not tremble when Walter touched the side of his neck. Another day he kept his head lifted long enough to drink from the pail instead of having Walter hold it beneath his mouth. His coat, once stiff with mud and fear, began to loosen under slow brushing. The dark brown hair still lay rough in patches, and the left shoulder remained tender where the red mark showed beneath the winter growth, but the ribs no longer seemed quite as sharp in the lamplight. Walter noticed small things because small things were all God gave at first. A warmer ear, a longer breath, a blink that came without panic, a step taken without the whole body shuddering afterward. Samuel noticed too. Every afternoon the boy came home from school with snow on his boots and his books clutched under one arm, and he went to the barn before he went to the kitchen. He never rushed into the stall. He had learned that much. He stood at the gate and waited, his breath white in front of his face, until Scout turned one ear toward him. Then Samuel would sit on the overturned bucket and talk in a low voice, not asking anything of the animal, not touching unless Walter said it was all right. He talked about arithmetic, which he hated. He talked about a boy at school who chewed pencils down to the metal. He talked about the way the playground looked when snow fell over the swing chains. Sometimes, when he thought Walter had gone back to the house, he talked about his mother's perfume, faint as flowers after rain, and his father's laugh coming through the wall while fixing something that did not need fixing. Scout listened the way horses listen, with skin and ears and stillness. Sometimes he lowered his head, sometimes his tail flicked once, sometimes he only breathed, slow and thin, while the boy's voice filled the stall like a cautious fire. The afternoon Scout stood. The barn was full of yellow light. It came through the cracks between the boards, narrow and warm, laying bright strips across the straw. Walter had just set down a mash of softened grain when Scout gathered his legs beneath him. For one long second nothing happened. Then the colt pushed upward. His knees wobbled. His hind legs spread too wide. His back arched like a bridge in a storm. Walter's hand lifted, ready to catch him, but he stopped himself before touching. Sometimes help came too fast and frightened the thing it meant to save. Samuel made a sound, no more than a breath. Scout stood, not strongly, not well, but he stood. That was when Martha Collins appeared in the barn doorway, as if she had been summoned by the sound of something surviving. She lived across the mountain road in a white farmhouse with a sagging porch and blue shutters that needed paint every year, and never got it. Martha was 68, a widow, short and sturdy, with silver hair pinned in a low bun, and eyes the pale blue-grey of January sky. Her cheeks were lined from weather and worry, and she wore a dark wool coat, rubber boots, and a knitted scarf tucked so tightly under her chin it looked prepared for battle. In one arm she carried cornbread wrapped in a towel, in the other a jar of salve. "I figured if that colt was still breathing," she said, stepping in without asking. "The rest of you probably forgot how to eat." Walter stared at her, then at the cornbread. "That a medical opinion?" "It is a neighbourly diagnosis," Martha said, "often fatal if ignored." Samuel laughed first. It was small and surprised, as if the sound had escaped before he could stop it. Walter looked at the boy, then felt his own mouth pull into a shape it had nearly forgotten. The laugh that came out of him was rough, almost rusty, but it was a laugh. Martha did not fuss over Scout. That was one reason Walter trusted her. She stood still and let the colt smell her glove. When he flinched, she drew her hand back without offense. Later, after Walter told her what Dr. Pike had found, she touched 2 fingers lightly to Scout's neck, not on the wound, not near the ribs, only where warmth still lived.
"Oh, this one needs more than medicine," she said. "He needs a family foolish enough to love him before he earns it."
From then on, Martha came every Tuesday and Friday, sometimes with soup, sometimes with a loaf of bread, sometimes with nothing but strong coffee and opinions. She taught Samuel how to stand at a horse's shoulder instead of square in front, how to keep one palm low, how to watch the ears before watching the eyes. She showed him how a frightened animal could read a boy's impatience through his feet. Samuel took every lesson seriously, as if Martha were teaching him a language that might one day let him speak to everything he had lost. In the kitchen, while Scout rested and the stove gave off its iron warmth, Martha sat with Walter at the old table. The room smelled of coffee gone strong, wood smoke, damp wool drying on chairbacks, and the faint sweetness of molasses from the cornbread. She spoke of her husband, gone 10 years now, a man who had whistled hymns off key and believed duct tape was one of the sacraments. Walter listened, thumb moving along the rim of his mug. He did not say much about Ruth, but once, when Martha mentioned the trouble with empty rooms, Walter reached across the table and turned Ruth's old cup so the handle faced the way she used to like it. Martha saw. She did not comment. Late in January, Scout began walking the yard. At first, Walter led him only a few steps beyond the barn, the blue blanket folded now on a rail instead of covering him. Snow squeaked under Walter's boots. Scout's hooves left narrow dark prints in the white. His legs still looked too long for his strength, and his left shoulder stiffened in the cold. But he moved. Samuel walked beside him, one hand near the lead rope, not grabbing it, just ready. By then the colt's coat had thickened into a dark brown winter roughness with a red shine where sunlight touched it. The white star on his forehead had become clear, no longer hidden beneath mud, small and uneven and bright as a mark left by a careful hand. One evening, Walter stood at the barn door and watched Samuel talk, while Scout lowered his head near the boy's chest. Samuel smiled, not the polite little smile adults received, but the unguarded kind that changed his whole face. Walter said nothing. He only stayed there in the cold, one hand on the doorframe, watching the house grow less empty in the last gold light of the day. The February storm came after midnight, not as falling snow at first, but as a sound against the house. It pressed at the windows. It ran its white fingers under the porch boards and through the gaps in the barn wall. By morning, the yard had disappeared beneath a smooth, wind-carved sheet, and the fence posts looked like dark teeth standing in milk. The old road beyond Walter Bennett's mailbox was gone. Not covered. Gone? The mountain had taken it back, as if no one had ever crossed there with groceries, firewood, schoolbooks, or grief. For 2 days, they stayed inside the narrow world left to them. Walter kept the stove fed. Martha Collins came over before the drifts grew too deep, and then simply did not leave. She slept in the chair near the kitchen stove with her boots still on, silver hair pinned loosely now, a quilt over her lap, one hand always near her coffee cup. Samuel made a game of measuring the snow on the porch rail. Scout stood in the barn under the low roof, stronger than he had been in autumn, but still cautious in his body, his dark winter coat thick, the white star on his forehead showing whenever the lantern caught it. On the 3rd day, Samuel stopped measuring the snow. At first, it seemed like the kind of sickness children collected in winter. a dull face at breakfast, a spoon left untouched in a bowl of oatmeal, a cough behind a closed fist. Walter put another split of maple into the stove and told himself the boy only needed rest. Martha steeped tea with honey and lemon, and Samuel drank half of it because Martha had a way of looking at a person that made disobedience feel like too much work. By evening, the boy's cheeks burned red, his hair stuck damp to his forehead. When Walter sat beside the bed and touched the back of his hand to Samuel's skin, he did not say anything. He only pulled the blanket higher and watched the boy's chest rise and fall too quickly beneath it. The house seemed to listen with him. The old floorboards creaked in the cold. Wind struck the north wall hard enough to make the framed photograph of Ruth tremble on the dresser. Somewhere under the eaves, ice clicked and shifted like small bones. On the fourth night, Samuel's breathing changed. It came short and dry, catching at the end. Not loud, that was what made it worse. A loud cough filled a room and asked for attention. This sound hid inside the boy, small and stubborn, as if each breath had to find a narrower door than the last. Martha sat on the edge of the bed and laid her hand on Samuel's forehead. Then she looked at Walter. No speech was needed between people who had watched sickness before. Walter reached for the telephone on the hallway table. The line gave only a dull, empty hush, then a crackle that went nowhere. He tried again. The same sound. Martha came to stand beside him, and the two of them listened to the dead line as if prayer might travel through copper if enough desperation stood nearby.
"He needs antibiotics," she said at last. Walter nodded once. "Tonight," she added.
The nearest pharmacy was beyond Crawford Notch, across a road now buried under snow and wind. Earlier that day, Martha's neighbor Jacob had tried to get his truck down the first bend and had come back walking, white-faced and cursing softly, after the tires sank before the old stone wall. A plough would not reach them before morning, maybe not before the next day. Morning was too far away. Walter stood in the hallway with the phone still in his hand. His fingers had gone pale around it. Through the bedroom doorway, Samuel's breath caught again, a thin sound, a little candle trying to stay lit. Walter set the receiver down carefully. Martha watched him. "Walter!" He went to the closet and took his heavy coat from the hook. The sleeves were stiff with old cold. He put on his gloves, then took them off again because his hands were shaking too badly to fasten the buttons. Martha stepped forward, fastened them for him, and did not mention it. "Stay with him," Walter said. Her mouth tightened. "You're 74 years old. I was 74 yesterday, too. That road isn't a road tonight." Walter looked toward the dark window. Snow drove sideways through the beam of the porch light. Beyond the glass lay only blue-black movement, pine shadows, and weather with no mercy in it. He thought of all the miles he had ploughed as a younger man, those long county nights when he could read a ditch by the way snow curled over it. He thought of Ruth's hand in his during her last winter, small and dry and hot with fever. He thought of Bess, sold because money had demanded a sacrifice and he had handed over the only living creature that trusted him. He put his gloves back on. "I know the road," he said, but when he stepped into the barn, he knew that was only partly true. The road he knew belonged to daylight, tire tracks, mailboxes, culverts, and fence lines. The road outside now belonged to wind. Scout lifted his head before Walter reached the stall. The colt was no longer the ruined little body from Conway. He had grown through the winter, not into full strength, but into enough of it. His legs were steadier, his chest had filled some. The old red mark on his left shoulder still showed under the winter coat, and the cold made him favor that side when he turned too quickly. He watched Walter with ears forward, nostrils widening at the smell of snow on the man's coat. Walter set the lantern on a hook. Metal clicked softly against metal as he took down the old saddle. His fingers moved by memory, slower than they once had, checking straps, tightening buckles, testing leather that had not carried urgency in years. Scout shifted under the saddle but did not pull away. His breath steamed in the lantern light. Walter rested his forehead against the horse's neck. "We have to do this, old friend," he whispered. Scout stood still. They left the barn into a world without edges. The first half-mile was hard, but known. Walter leaned forward in the saddle, one gloved hand low on the reins, the other tucked against his coat where he would later keep the medicine from freezing. Snow struck his face and melted along his beard before turning cold again. The wind stole sound, then returned it broken. The deep thud of Scout's hooves under crusted snow, the scrape of branches, the hard rasp of Walter's own breath inside his scarf. Past the old stone wall, the road began to vanish in earnest. Scout picked his way forward, not fast, never fast, but with a careful firmness Walter came to trust one step at a time. The horse's ears moved constantly, catching what the old man could not see. Once he stopped before a fallen branch hidden in powder. Once he angled away from a drift that would have swallowed them to the knee. Walter did not praise him loudly. He only loosened the reins and let the animal choose the better line. It took hours to reach the pharmacy beyond the notch. The building was dark except for one light in the rear. Walter pounded on the door with the flat of his hand until his palms stung. At last, a young pharmacist appeared, maybe 30, narrow-faced, hair flattened on one side from sleep, wearing a cardigan over pajama pants and boots without socks. He opened the door, ready to be angry. Then he saw Walter's face, the ice clinging to his cap, the horse standing in the road, with snow gathered along his mane. "Boy's sick," Walter said, and that was enough. The medicine was small, almost insultingly small, when the pharmacist placed it in Walter's hand. A bottle and a packet, wrapped in paper. Walter tucked them inside his coat against his shirt, where his old heart beat slow and hard under layers of wool. The ride home was worse. The wind had turned meaner, driving the snow in sheets across the road. Walter could not feel his toes. His fingers had become wooden shapes around the reins. More than once, his head dipped and snapped up again. Scout kept moving beneath him, breath strong enough now to rise in white bursts, though his gait shortened when the cold bit into the old injury in his shoulder. Then he stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Walter blinked snow from his lashes. "Go on." Scout did not move. His body tightened under the saddle. Both ears pointed into the dark. Walter pressed his heels lightly, then harder. The horse stood as if rooted to the mountain itself. The lantern hanging from the saddle cast a weak yellow circle ahead. At first Walter saw only snow, smooth snow, too smooth, no brush tips, no black line of ditch, no broken weed stems, just a pale, perfect surface where the road should have been. His throat closed. The drift had covered the edge of the drop-off near the bend above the ravine. One more step would have taken them over the hidden lip and down into the black cut below. Walter's hand opened on the reins. "Lead," he said, barely more than breath. Scout lowered his head, turned left by inches, and began to pick a path around the buried edge. His hooves, tested, withdrew, found ground again. Walter sat still, letting the horse's body read what his eyes could not. When they reached firmer road, the old man bent forward, not from courage, but from the weakness that followed nearly dying. They were close to home when the shapes appeared. One moved first between the pines, then another, then two more, low and silent against the snow. Wolves. 4 of them, lean from winter, grey backs dusted white, eyes catching the lantern light in brief yellow flashes. They did not rush, they spread. Scout felt them before Walter could gather himself. The horse stopped again, but this time he turned his body sideways, placing himself between the nearest wolf and the old man's leg. His head dropped, his ears pinned halfway back. The muscles along his neck stood out beneath the dark coat. A low sound came out of him, not a neigh, not a scream, something deeper. Then Scout struck the frozen ground with one front hoof, once, twice, 3 times. The sound carried through the storm like a hammer on iron. The nearest wolf checked its step. The others paused. Scout did not rear. He did not bolt. He stood, shaking from cold or strain, but standing. Walter's hand found the rough mane and held there, his fingers too numb to grip properly. The largest wolf stared for a long moment, snow blowing between them like torn cloth. Then it turned its head. One by one, the shapes withdrew into the trees. Walter did not move until they were gone. Only then did he realize there were tears frozen along his cheeks. Beneath him, Scout breathed steady white clouds into the dark, the small star on his forehead catching the lantern glow each time he lifted his head. Dawn came thin and grey behind the pines, as if the storm had spent itself but had not yet forgiven the mountain. Walter Bennett saw the house before he fully believed in it. The roofline appeared through blowing snow first, then the porch light, still burning pale yellow above the steps. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney and flattened under the low sky. Beneath him, Scout moved with a shortened stride, steady but tired, his dark coat crusted white along the mane and shoulders. The horse's breath came out in slow clouds. Walter's own breath felt smaller, caught somewhere behind the wool scarf, frozen stiff against his beard. He did not remember the last 100 yards clearly. He remembered the medicine inside his coat, held against his chest by one numb hand. He remembered the sound of Scout's hooves breaking through crusted snow. He remembered the barn, the porch, and then Martha Collins opening the door before he could knock, as if she had been standing on the other side all night, listening for the shape of hope. Her face changed when she saw him. Not dramatically. Martha was not a woman who wasted movement. But her blue-grey eyes dropped to his frozen gloves, then to the snow packed along his coat, then to the place under his arm where his hand still held the medicine. Walter tried to speak. His mouth did not shape the words properly. He only pulled the packet and bottle from inside his coat and placed them in her hands.
Martha took them with both palms, warm from the kitchen. For one breath, her fingers covered his. Then she turned and went straight to Samuel.
Walter stepped inside and the room tilted. He did not fall all at once. He folded slowly, like an old gate giving up after a long winter. One knee struck the floor. His shoulder brushed the wall. The last thing he saw before Martha's voice came sharp from the bedroom was Scout through the open door, standing in the grey dawn with his head lowered, reins trailing loose in the snow. After that, the house became a place of small sounds, the spoon against the medicine bottle, Martha's feet crossing from stove to bed and back again, the low pop of embers in the firebox, Samuel's rough breathing, then later, less rough. Walter woke and slept in pieces on the old sofa, wrapped in quilts that smelled of cedar, smoke, and dry wool. His hands burned when they began to thaw. Then they ached. Then they lost feeling again. Martha muttered over them with warm cloths and a temper aimed mostly at the storm, partly at Walter, and perhaps a little at God for making old men stubborn enough to be useful.
"You will drink this," she told him once, holding a cup near his mouth. Walter opened one eye. "Is it coffee?" "It is whatever keeps you from dying on my watch." He drank it.
For several days the house held them that way, Samuel in the bed, Walter on the sofa, Martha between them like a small weather system of soup, medicine, towels, prayer, and orders. The air smelled of bitter antibiotics, chicken broth, damp socks drying near the stove, and coffee stretched too thin because no one had the heart to grind more. Outside, the storm loosened its grip. Snow slid from the roof in soft, heavy sighs. Drops began to fall from the eaves and tick against the porch boards. Once, Walter woke to the sound of Scout shifting in the barn, a low scrape of hoof against wood, and he lay still until he heard the horse blow softly through his nose. Samuel's fever broke near morning on the third day. It did not arrive like a miracle with music and light. It came as a damp sheet, a calmer breath, Martha's hand pausing on the boy's forehead, and then her shoulders lowering by less than an inch. Walter saw that inch from the sofa and closed his eyes before anyone noticed. The boy was not well, not all at once. His face stayed pale, and his body seemed smaller beneath the blankets. But the terrible tightness left his breathing. He slept without fighting for air. When he finally asked for water in a hoarse little voice, Martha turned away toward the stove and wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist as if smoke had offended her. Days passed before Samuel could stand long enough to cross a room. Walter was not much better. His knees had stiffened from the ride. His fingers stayed tender and slow, and the skin along two knuckles cracked when he bent them. Age did not politely step aside just because a man had done something brave. It remained in the joints afterward, collecting its due. Still, one pale morning, Samuel appeared at the foot of the sofa wearing boots, an unbuttoned coat, and no hat. Walter looked at him over the rim of his cup. "Martha sees you like that, she'll bury us both." Samuel did not smile, but his eyes had returned to him. "I need to see Scout." Walter did not stop him. The snow outside had hardened overnight and shone under a weak sun. The air smelled clean in the strange way it does after a long storm, like cold wood, wet bark, and something newly opened. Samuel crossed the yard slowly, one hand brushing the fence for balance. Walter followed only as far as the porch, because his legs were not yet ready for more. Martha stood behind him with a folded blanket over one arm and said nothing. Scout was in the barn doorway, his coat rough from winter, his left shoulder still a little stiff when he shifted his weight. When Samuel reached him, the boy put both arms around the horse's neck and held on. Scout stood still. His ears moved once toward the sound of the boy's breath. Then he lowered his head just enough for Samuel's cheek to rest against him. They stayed that way a long while. "Did Scout save me?" Samuel asked without turning around. Walter held the porch rail. The wood was cold beneath his bandaged fingers. "He saved both of us." A few mornings later, when Walter could move more easily, he sat by the kitchen window with a cup of weak coffee cooling in his hands. Scout stood near the fence where the sunlight reached first. The storm had scrubbed the world bright. Snow lay blue in the shadows and gold where morning touched it. When Scout turned his head, the white star on his forehead flashed clear and even. Walter set the cup down, then the horse shifted, and the sun fell across his left shoulder. Beneath the thicker winter coat, the old red mark showed through, muted now but unmistakable. Walter stopped breathing for a moment. Bess had carried that same star, that same red mark on the left shoulder. 22 years ago, Walter had sold her in a winter that had taken Ruth's health, his savings, and most of his pride. He had told himself a man could not keep everything he loved. He still believed that, but the belief no longer felt like a locked door. He went outside slowly. Each step pulled at his knees and his bandaged fingers ached in the cold. Scout watched him approach, calm but alert, not moving away. Walter stopped at the fence, then reached out and placed his palm on the white star. The horse exhaled, warm against his sleeve. Walter did not ask for proof. He did not need the world to explain what it had placed before him. Behind him, Martha stood on the porch with a coffee cup held in both hands, her silver hair loose at her temples, her face softened by the thin morning light. She looked from the old man to the horse and smiled, as if she had been waiting a long time to see someone forgiven without a word. Walter kept his hand on the star. Martha only smiled from the porch. Sometimes God does not send miracles wrapped in thunder or bright light. Sometimes he sends them quietly, in the eyes of a wounded animal, in the hands of an old man who still chooses kindness, or in a small white star on the forehead of a horse everyone else had given up on. Walter thought he was saving Scout that day at the livestock market, but in the end, Scout carried him through the storm, stood between him and danger, and helped bring Samuel back to life. Maybe that is how grace often works. We give what little we have, not knowing that one day love may return to us in a form we never expected. In our own lives, we may pass by someone who looks too broken, too tired, too far gone. A neighbor, a stranger, an old friend, even a quiet animal waiting in the cold. But one small act of mercy can become the beginning of something much larger than we can see. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Tell us in the comments, have you ever seen kindness come back in a way you did not expect? And if you enjoy stories of faith, animals, and the quiet miracles that still happen in ordinary lives, please subscribe and join us for the next story. May God bless you, your family, and every gentle heart still choosing kindness in a difficult world.